It's 1990. I'm 15. I'm hanging out with a couple of mates on a hilltop in Bristol. It's a residential street, and I'm hanging out with Royston and Spike. They're a couple of good mates of mine. We're really nicely dressed guys, you know, nice tracksuit top and bottom. It was nice and yellow. And we had nice blings on, and we had nice trainers. Mine were Nike Air Max. Coming up the hill is a taxi. And as it pulls up, I realise it's my uncle. And he winds the window down. He says, "Why are you not in school? Eh? Your mother is looking for you. Get in the car." As we roll down the hill and coming towards our house, I notice there's a crowd of people waiting for me. It's quite strange, actually, because I recognise most of them. But I ignored them as I went up the stairs into my mum's bedroom, where she's packing a suitcase. She's very distressed. "What's up?" "Well, you remember the plane that your father and your sisters were on? They were going to Nigeria, but it may have crashed in Tunisia, and we're going there tonight." I won't lie to you. The first thing that came to my mind at that particular point in time was, Tunisia. I've never been there. When we get to the airport, my mum takes care of all the paperwork. So it wasn't actually until we got onto the plane that I realised that I'd been tricked. See, the announcement from the pilot was that we weren't going to Tunisia, but we were going to Nigeria, direct. When we got to Nigeria, there was a driver waiting for us with a really plush Mercedes-Benz, and it took us all the way to this other really plush building, mansion complex. And this mansion was huge. It had big walls with spikes on it and a massive corrugated gate. And when we went through, we went into a really plush sort of front room. And in this front room, there was on a desk, there was a plaque, and it read my family name. So I turned to my mum and I said, "Is this my dad's house?" She said, "No, it's your uncle's." Tutus, he comes through the door with 6 elderly guys. The 6 elderly guys go and take a seat on the sofa. And my uncle, who's a magnificent-looking guy, gives my mum a big hug. And as he sits down, I sit down, and my mum stands up. She throws her hands up in the air. "Oluwa, kilamashe." Lord, what are we going to do? This boy doesn't listen to anybody. Eh? He's a bad influence to his sisters. He doesn't go to school. He's in trouble with the police. He's on drugs. Of course, she was right, but I'd been betrayed, okay? In her distress, my uncle takes her out the room. A few minutes later, I hear a car pulling up outside. I look out the window, and I see my mum getting into a taxi and leaving me here with my uncle and his 6 cronies. Life wasn't necessarily bad in the mansion. I mean, it was a mansion. So, but that said, I wanted to get outside of the compound and the complex. My uncle made it very clear that if you choose to go outside, you will lose that shirt, okay? Those trousers, you will not come back with them. And are those Nike Air Max? And they were. Some really nice Nike Air Max, which, ironically as it should happen, I didn't want to lose them considering they belonged to somebody else about a month back. Anyway, so I lasted a couple of weeks in the house, got into trouble with my uncle, and he decided he couldn't take care of me anymore. So he packed me up into this lovely plush Mercedes, and his driver took me for a drive. The next place we stopped was a really sandy street. And on this sandy street, there were children playing in shorts and barefoot. They were playing football. And there were mums feeding babies, washing clothes, teenagers hanging out. It was a really residential area. And the thing is, the street is divided from the residential properties by a long, open gutter that goes from one side of the building to one side of the street to the other. And across this gutter are planks of wood, which give you access to the houses. Across one of these planks of wood came an elderly woman. She was quite robust, with really big, pursed lips, and she was coming at me. Anyway, as she plastered these kisses all over my face, she announced herself to me as my grandmother. She had a room and parlour, and she told me to put my stuff in her room because it would be safe there. Or at least that's what she told me. You see, because the next morning when I woke up, my cousin was wearing my trousers, and my uncle was bussing one of my spare shoes, and my grandma was stretching out my T-shirt. She entertained me for about 3 days, and then she said, really, you gotta get to work. Now, during one of these days that I was going to go and find some work, I stepped onto this plank, and another foot stepped onto the plank as well. It was quite big. And as I looked up, his head was blocked out by the sun, so I couldn't really see who it was. So I told him, get out of my way. He shoved me back, and we ended up doing this tussle and a dance that ended up with us wrestling on the floor. My grandma throws her hands up in the air. What are you doing? What are you doing? Stop. Why are you fighting? You are brothers. We entertained ourselves with that for a couple of weeks. That said, coming a couple of weeks later, another gentleman came across that plank. He was really smartly dressed, and he was in an Air Force uniform. He came striding across that plank and right up to my grandmother. And then he lays himself prostrate on the ground, as you do with elderly African Nigerian women. And then she stood up and gave her a big hug. And my brother then told me that, in fact, that this was my father, who promptly came across to me and gave me a good, firm handshake and a nod. It was emotional. He stuck around for a little while. While I was living in this house in Nigeria, I had a dog. It was a Rhodesian Ridgeback called Buster, and he followed me everywhere. In fact, it wasn't my dog; it was my other uncle's dog, and he didn't want to look after it, so it was my responsibility. Now, my uncle and my dad decided they were going to take me to a soup kitchen in Nigeria, and this is really where we have a couple of beers and stuff. So on our way there, they told me to take the dog with me. Yeah, so that was not going to be too hard. He follows me everywhere. So he came along, and as we got to the soup kitchen, we tied it up next to the kitchen. And we went in and had a couple of drinks. A few hours later, a bowl of soup came and landed in front of me. And I tasted it. It was really spicy, really hot, really meaty. It tasted real good, and I told my uncle so too. And that's when he leaned in and he said, you do realise Buster is not coming home. My dad stuck around for a few weeks, and then eventually he had to go back to Benin. Now, he left us here hungry and really without any money, which resulted in myself and my brother having to sell a lot of my goods. One of those, of course, happened to be, ironically, the trainers I didn't want to lose. I ended up having to sell those trainers. That said, there was a bidding war for it, and the guy who eventually won it was actually 2 sizes too big for it. Irrelevant, but I ended up selling my Nike Air Max for £7 UK and an oversized flip-flops. When we finally, when my brother finally decided that, we really do need to actually get a job, he took us for a walk. Went for about 5 kilometers. And where we were going, I could actually smell it. I really mean smell it before we got there. It was putrid, like pungent garbage. And in fact, it was just that, garbage. Miles and miles of the garbage. And it was high as like a mountain, even though there was a huge wall that was hiding it all behind. I could see that there were people living on this garbage heap. And there were children playing on it. They were literally like ankle deep in muck. It turns out this is where we were going to work. So the next day, my job was simple. It was to get knee deep into this garbage and stick my hand in, rummage around, and find a shoe. And once we found that shoe, we'd take the leather off, and we'd take the rubber sole and put it into a 50-kilogram sack. Now, once that sack was full, we'd throw it on our back, okay, and we'd walk for another 5 kilometers towards some European or Western companies that were in some industrial estates. I mean, this was a really dusty road with trucks going up and down it, and really the stench of garbage just following you everywhere. When we get there, the companies would then take the sack, they'd weigh it, okay, and then hand over 50 naira for each 50-kilogram sack. I won't even bother telling you how much that is. But nonetheless, we stuck around there for a little while. As it turns out, there was another guy who was working on a thing, and one day he shouted out, I found something, I found something. So we all ran over to find out what it is that he'd found. And lo and behold, in the ground was a carrier bag, and it had notes, like pound sterlings, all denominations of currency in it, like pound sterlings, dollars, francs. It was all there. And I was like, whoa, what happened here? So it turns out it must have been a party or something that was going on, and Nigerians like to spend money. So knowing the denominations that were in the bag, I got my hand in and stuck out all the pound sterlings and stuffed them into my pocket. So with all these pound sterlings in my pocket, my brother's got a nice little share of francs as well. We were living pretty good. We went and got a nice little apartment. We got ourselves some new clothes, you know what I'm saying? We're looking pretty good. However, it wasn't complete. I had to complete the setup next day by going to a guy who I knew very well, and he does something very special. He would sit me down, he took my measurement, and right there in front of me, he handmade me a brand new pair of shoes. It's beautiful. Anyway, with my new shoes, I got a new job, lived a little bit of a better life. It wasn't till about a year and 9 months later that my uncle came back for me. And he said, get in the car. So I got in the car, we went back to his house. And when we got to his house, he said, listen, you, my son, need to be humble. I was like, why? My mum comes through the door. I lay myself down directly in front of her, threw myself down begging for her to take me back and forgive me and everything, which of course she did. And that night, she took me back to England. When we arrived back in England, it was really, really cold. But none of that really bothered me because my journey had pretty much come to an end, but more importantly, I now had on my feet a brand new pair of well-earned, handmade Nigerian shoes.